Well, good morning. Open your Bible, please. Esther chapter 3. Esther chapter 3, that's where we're going to begin our lesson this morning. And while you're turning there, let me ask you a question. If you were invited to have a meeting with the president at the White House, how would you look when you walked into the Oval Office? What would you wear? You know, most people, you probably wouldn't wear a t-shirt and shorts, right? Meeting the president, unlikely you're going to wear a t-shirt and shorts. You're likely going to wear a nice suit, maybe your best suit or a nice dress. And why is that? Well, it's because we respect the office of president, isn't it? We want the president to look at us and be like, yeah, I don't regret this person being invited here, right? We don't want to make the president angry, right? And so we're gonna wear our nicest clothes. Maybe we're gonna buy a new suit or a new dress. And so that's likely how we would look. But what would our demeanor be? If you were invited to the office of president, what would your demeanor be? What would your attitude be? You know, just imagine with me for a moment, if you were like having the worst week of your life. I mean, this week has just gone horribly, but then you end up in the president's office for a meeting. Are you going to bring all that stuff with you? Are you going to allow your grief or sorrow or anger or whatever, anxiety, are you going to allow that to show on your face? Likely not. Likely not. Likely you're going to put on a happy face or a happy mask, and you're going to walk into the president's office with a smile on your face. And again, you ask the question of why? Well, you know, we don't want to make the president feel awkward or anything. It's a sort of a case of respect. And so even if I'm having the worst day of my life, I'm going to walk into the president's office with a happy face on, with a happy mask on. And this really isn't a new thing. This is something that we can see throughout the history of mankind. We even see it in Bible days where people put on this happy mask for kings. Ryan read from Esther chapter 3. I just want to reread that here for just a moment. I'm going to start in verse 14 though. In the context of Esther chapter 3, this decree has been issued in Susa and the rest of the provinces as well. And the decree essentially said, okay, all of the Jews on this one day or 2 days are going to be killed. And so that decree has an effect on the people. And we're going to see that. Pick it up in verse 14. And so a copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province by proclamation to all the peoples to be ready for that day. The couriers went out hurriedly by order of the king, and the decree was issued in Susa, the citadel, and the king and Haman sat down to drink. But the city of Susa was thrown into confusion. And so we look at this verse, we look at the last verse, verse 15, and we're told something about the city of Susa. Because of this decree, the city of Susa was thrown into confusion. Thank you. They were thrown into confusion. But what are the king and Haman doing? They're drinking. They're partying. And so the city of Susa, the king's people, they're kind of confused. Some of them are probably shocked at what's going on. Some of them are probably angry at what's happening. Some of them who are Jews are probably fearful. Maybe they're mourning. We're actually going to see that a little bit later. Some of them are mourning. And so there's all of this stuff going on with the king's people. Confusion, anxiety, fear, sorrow. But the king's not worried about any of that. The king has distanced himself from the people. And so the people are mourning, but the king is throwing a party. The king is feasting. The king is getting drunk. We can continue chapter 4, verse 1 now. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes. He went into the midst of the city. He cried out with a loud and bitter cry. He went up to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one was allowed to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. And in every province where the king's where the king's command and his decree reached, there was great mourning among the Jews with fasting and weeping and lamenting. And many of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. And so what are the Jews doing? in this context? They're mourning. That's exactly right. They're mourning. They're sitting in sackcloth and ashes. But the king, he's not mourning. He's partying in his castle. And so again, we see this theme where the kings are so distanced from the people. The kings don't understand what the people are going through. And I think that was purposeful. Look at verse 2. Verse 2, it reads, "And he," that is Mordecai, "went up to the entrance of the king's gate." Why? "For no one was allowed to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth." And so here we see that no one's allowed to enter the king's gates. No one's allowed to enter the king's castle. No one is allowed to enter the king's throne room clothed in sackcloth. And you have to ask, okay, why? Why is no one allowed to enter the king's throne room clothed in sackcloth? Well, because the king doesn't want to see it. You're mourning? Don't bring that in here. It's interesting. If you read through the book of Esther, there are so many feasts. I think there's something along the lines 3 or 4 different feasts that just go, or maybe it's 6. I don't remember. There's a number, and it's one of those. And there's just feast all throughout the book of Esther. And the idea is this king, he's always feasting. He's always partying. He's always getting drunk. And so no mourning in my castle. I don't want anyone else to bring me down. You may be mourning, but you do that out there. The king was distanced from the people on purpose. On purpose. And we see the same thing in the book of Nehemiah. Go ahead and turn to Nehemiah chapter 1. Nehemiah chapter 1. Nehemiah comes across some men who come back from Judah, from Jerusalem. And so he asks them, "Oh, how's Jerusalem doing? How's Judah doing?" They tell him, "Judah's not doing so good." And so we see Nehemiah's response. We're going to start in verse 1 of chapter 1. "The words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. Now it happened in the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, as I was in Susa the citadel, that Hanani, one of my brothers, came with certain men from Judah. And I asked them concerning the Jews who escaped, who had survived the exile, and concerning Jerusalem. And they said to me, 'The remnant there in the province who have survived the exile is in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates destroyed by fire.' And as soon as I heard these words," verse 4, "I sat down and wept and mourned for days. And I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven." And so when Nehemiah hears the shameful state of Jerusalem, he's sorrowful. He's mourning. But here's the thing. Nehemiah works for the king. He works for the king. He works in the king's presence. He's the king's cupbearer. And so what does he do whenever he gets before the king? Let's go to chapter 2 now. Chapter 2 of Nehemiah. "In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence. And the king said to me, 'Why is your face sad, seeing you are not sick? This is nothing but sadness of heart.' Then I was very much afraid. I said to the king, 'Let the king live forever. Why should not my face be sad when the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire?'" And so we're told here in verse 1, at the end of verse 1 of chapter 2, that Nehemiah, he explicitly says, "Now I had not been sad in his presence." So Nehemiah takes special care to tell us that he had not been sad in his presence. And so what did Nehemiah do? Nehemiah is feeling all of this sorrow. He's anguishing over the state of Jerusalem. But whenever he walks into the king's presence, he puts on a happy mask. He doesn't want the king to see how he truly feels. But the king sees through it. The king sees through it, and he says, "Why are you sad? This is nothing but sadness of heart." And when the king sees through Nehemiah's sadness, the text tells us, "Then I was very much afraid." Why is Nehemiah afraid? Well, because you don't approach the king's presence with a sad face. The king doesn't want to see that. The king doesn't want to see mourning. It also might have something to do with he was the king's cupbearer. And if this was a paranoid king, the king might assume you're trying to poison him or something, and that's why you have a sad face. That could be part of it. But kings in the ancient world, they don't want to see you mourning. They don't want to see your problems. You see, kings in the ancient world, there was this disconnect. They were disconnected from their people. They didn't understand the people, and they didn't really want to understand the people. Well, why do I bring this up? Why do I bring this up? I bring this up because Jesus is different. We're going to the book of Hebrews. The book of Hebrews now, Hebrews chapter 4 is where we're going to be. And we're going to pick up from verse 14. Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 14. You can turn there because that's not going to stay up. And all the verses aren't going to be on the screen. Hebrews chapter 4, we're going to start in verse 14. And here, the author of Hebrews talks about how we have a great high priest. And not just any kind of high priest, one who understands us. And so we could pick up in verse 14 here. Since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weakness, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then, with confidence, draw near to the throne of grace that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. And so the author of Hebrews, the preacher of Hebrews, he tells us that we have this great high priest who is able to sympathize with us. And why is he able to sympathize with us? It's because he has been tempted as we have been tempted, yet he is without sin. And so in verse 16 he says, so we can draw near to God's throne. We can draw near to God's throne with confidence. But what does that mean? What does it mean to draw near to the throne with confidence? Let me see if I can figure out this laser. Nope. All right. What does it mean? You know, some of your translations might say boldly. Maybe it doesn't say confidence. But what does it mean to approach God's throne boldly? Because the reason I ask that is I don't think boldly or confidence really I don't think they paint the whole picture. I think there's more that we are to see in that word. Let us with confidence draw near to the throne of grace. As I was studying for this lesson, by the way, we're continuing on in Hebrews. So we're going to deal with chapter 4 and verse 14 down to chapter 5 and verse 10 or so. That's the section we're dealing with in this lesson. And as I was studying, I was reading a translation by a scholar named William Lane. He did a really good commentary on the book of Hebrews. And this is what William Lane's translation says in verse 16. I'm just going to put that translation up there in verse 16. He says, therefore, let us draw near to the throne of grace with a bold frankness, so that we may receive mercy and obtain grace at the time when we are in need of help. And I think that translation conveys the meaning of the text just a little bit better. It's not just that we are approaching God's throne with boldness. It's not just that we are approaching God's throne with confidence. We're approaching God's throne with a bold frankness. That word in the Greek, it does mean confidence, it does mean boldness, but it also means openness. It also means speaking frankly or with frankness. It also means speaking plainly. As a matter of fact, we see that in the Gospels. This word in the Gospels is used over and over again when Jesus speaks plainly. I'm going to give you a couple examples. You don't have to turn there. In Mark chapter 8, I'm going to pick up in verse 31. And he, that is Jesus, he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he said this plainly. And so Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But here we're told that Jesus, he's talking about his death in Mark chapter 8 here. He's talking about his death, and he's not hiding it behind metaphor or symbolism. He tells them plainly. He's open with them. He's frank with them. And we see it again in John chapter 10. In John chapter 10, some of the Jews come to Jesus and they're like, if you are the Christ, tell us plainly. There's our word again for confidence. Tell us plainly if you are the Christ. Don't keep us in suspense. Be open with us. Be frank with us. Just tell us the truth. And then in John chapter 11, when Lazarus dies, Jesus tells the disciples, he tells them, Lazarus has fallen asleep. And the disciples say, well, if he has fallen asleep, he will wake up again. And they don't get that Jesus is using a metaphor for death here. And so the text tells us Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus has died. And so the idea again is Jesus is just being frank. He's telling them plainly. And so when we bring that to our text in Hebrews chapter 4, the author of Hebrews is saying, we have a high priest who is able to sympathize with us. He understands us, so what? So let us draw near to the throne of grace with a bold frankness. We don't have to wear a happy mask for our King. And so the question for us is, why? Why can we approach God's throne with a bold frankness? I want to give you one thing, and then we'll talk about application, and then the lesson will be yours. Why are we able to approach God's throne with a bold frankness? Well, because Jesus understands. Jesus understands. Earlier we saw that kings of the ancient world, they were so disconnected from the people, they didn't understand the people's pain. They didn't understand the people's anxiety. They didn't understand. They didn't connect with the people. Jesus does. He understands. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever had one of those moments when it feels like Satan's attacks never stop? Like it just seems like Satan is just beating you down and beating you down and beating you down. He's like holding you underwater and he doesn't let you up for any breath. There's no relief. Have you ever felt that way? Let me ask another question. Have you ever been so far into grief where you just stay up the whole night crying and praying and wondering if God is hearing? Have you ever felt that way? In those moments of pain and sorrow, we need to understand Jesus gets it. Jesus understands our pain. We talked just a second ago about how sometimes we go through these times where Satan is just beating us down and beating us down and beating us. He never lets us take a break. Jesus gets that. Pick up in verse 14 again of Hebrews chapter 4. Since then, we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weakness, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Sometimes we may be tempted to think that Satan surely took it easy on Jesus because he is God. That's just not so. Jesus has been tempted in every respect as we are. And so when we have those moments where we feel like Satan isn't giving us a break, he just keeps hitting on us, and Jesus felt that too. Jesus, he understands. And we talked earlier about how sometimes we spend the whole night crying and praying, wondering if God listens, and our friends, they might not even understand why we're doing what we're doing. Jesus gets that. Jump down to chapter 5 and verse 7. Chapter 5 and verse 7. I'm going to just read to the end of our section here, down to verse 10. In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverence. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. And being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him, being designated by God a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. We're not going to talk about that this morning. We'll come back to the order of Melchizedek stuff. But notice what it says. In the days of his flesh, he offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death. When Jesus was in that garden, he prayed all night. And he cried all night. As a matter of fact, one text tells us whenever he's talking to his disciples, he says, I'm very sorrowful, even to death. And so Jesus understands. When we stay up all night crying and praying, and when no one else gets it, because his disciples weren't there for him, his friends couldn't be relied upon, Jesus understands our pain. And so, what does that mean? It means we can approach God's throne with a bold frankness. It means we can approach God's throne and take off this happy mask that we sometimes wear around. We can be honest with God. We can be real with God. We can tell him what our sorrows are. We can tell him where our pain is. We can tell him how we feel. God, I don't feel like you're listening. We see that all throughout the Psalms. And we can even tell God when we're angry with him. And there are some Christians who might say, surely not. You know, there are some Christians who would say, and luckily this is going away, but there are some Christians who would say, hey, you don't need to grieve. Just have faith. Because whenever you grieve, that just means you lack faith. There's some Christians who might say something like, you don't need to have anxiety. Just trust that God will get you through it. And you can't be angry with God. You can't do that. It just shows a lack of respect. I want to read through a psalm with you, the 88th Psalm. This is a psalm written by a man named Heman, the Ezrahite, not Haman of the book of Esther. Or maybe I should say Heman. Heman the Ezrahite. Psalm 88, I'm going to pick up in verse 1. Verse 1, he begins, O Lord, God of my salvation. That is the one positive note in this psalm. O Lord, God of my salvation, I cry out day and night before you. Let my prayer come before you. Incline your ear to my cry, for my soul is full of trouble, and my life draws near to Sheol. I am counted among those who go down to the pit. I am a man who has no strength. Like one set loose among the dead, like the slain that lie in the grave, like those whom you remember no more, for they are cut off from your hand. And so this man says, I'm sorrowful. I'm in pain. I might even die here. And why? In his mind, he says, it's because of you. We'll pick up in verse 6. You, O God, you have put me in the depths of the pit, in the regions dark and deep. Your wrath lies heavy upon me, and you overwhelm me with your waves. You have caused my companions to shun me. You have made me a horror to them. I am shut in so that I cannot escape. My eye grows dim through sorrow. Every day I call upon you, O Lord. I spread out my hands to you. And so he says, I've been praying, but you've been doing all of this stuff to me. At least that's how he feels. You've brought me to this place. And then he goes on to say in verse 10, do you work wonders for the dead? Do the departed rise to praise you? Is your steadfast love declared in the grave, or your faithfulness in Abaddon? Are your wonders known in the darkness, or your righteousness in the land of forgiveness? The idea is, if I'm going to die here, I'm not going to be able to praise you because I'm going to be dead. What good could I do for you if I'm dead? Verse 13. But I, O Lord, cry to you in the morning. My prayer comes before you. O Lord, why do you cast my soul away? Why do you hide your face from me? Afflicted and close to death, from my youth up I suffer your terrors. I am helpless. Your wrath has swept over me. Your dreadful assaults destroy me. They surround me like a flood all day long. They close in on me together. You have caused my beloved and my friend to shun me. My companions have become darkness. And so the psalmist says, you have put your hand against me. You've brought me to this horrible place. You've put the storm clouds over me. And you've even driven my friends away from me. And someone says, well, surely you can't say that to God. But he does. And here's the thing. God already knows how we feel anyway. And so why put the mask on? You see, Heman here, he approached God's throne with a bold frankness. He took the mask off. And so while Mordecai was unable to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth, we can enter God's gate with sackcloth on. We can walk into God's palace with sackcloth on. We can approach God's throne with sackcloth on. Again, there may be some Christians who disagree with this. They say, well, that's just showing a lack of faith. I disagree. God already knows how we feel anyway. He wants us to be honest with him. He wants us to approach his throne with a bold frankness. We can be frank with our God because he understands our hurt. He understands our pain. One more thing. Jesus, he understands There we go. There we go. Perfect. He understands our mistakes. We got there eventually. Jesus understands our mistakes. And don't mishear me on this. I'm not saying Jesus condones sin, condones our mistakes. I'm not saying he ignores sin or anything like that. I mean, Jesus, he's understanding when we make mistakes. We see this. We're going to pick up in chapter 5 of Hebrews, going back to the book now. At chapter 5 of Hebrews, verse 1. For every high priest chosen from among men is appointed to act on behalf of men in relation to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. And so we see here, just in verse 1, that every high priest is chosen from among men. Earlier in the book, we're told that Jesus had to become like his brothers. Here we're told why. Because every high priest is chosen from among men. But why? Why is every high priest chosen from among men? We see it in verse 2. Verse 2. He, the high priest, who is chosen from among men, he can deal gently with the ignorant and wayward, since he himself is beset with weakness. Because of this, he is obligated to offer sacrifice for his own sins, just as he does for those of the people. And no one takes this honor, talking about being high priest, no one takes this honor for himself, but only when called by God, just as Aaron was. And then the text tells us how Jesus was called. But what we see here is that high priests are chosen from among men so that they can deal gently with other people's mistakes. So they can deal gently with the ignorant and wayward. And so Jesus had to become a man, had to become like his brothers. Why? So that he could be our high priest and so that he could deal gently with us when we make mistakes. You know, none of us are perfect. None of us are perfect. And so who do we need? We need our King. We need Jesus. And this is an extremely important lesson. This is an extremely important lesson that we take home, because some people feel like they've messed up so much. They've done something so horrible that God will never forgive them. And so they don't approach God's throne. They don't approach God's throne with repentance and asking for forgiveness. God's never going to forgive me anyway. If you speak it, you make it real. It's sort of that sort of thing. If you speak it, we know God knows, but whenever we say it, now God really knows. And he's going to be so angry with us. And he's never going to forgive us. And he's going to strike us down. So we never approach God's throne because we think it's going to be like the Old Testament. You know, if you walked into God's throne room while you were defiled in the Old Testament, what happened? You died. And so I can't approach God's throne with all the mistakes that I've made. It's not true. It's not true. Our God became a man so that he could deal gently with us. He understands. He understands. He doesn't condone our mistakes. He's understanding when we do make mistakes. And he is ready for us to approach his throne with a bold frankness so that he can offer us grace and mercy whenever we need help, so he can offer us forgiveness. And so that's what we see. That's what we see. Jesus understands. He understands our pain, and he understands our mistakes. But how does this apply to you and me? What do we need to take home from this? Well, we need to be understanding. We need to be understanding. And so first of all, we must be understanding of others' pain. You know, we talked earlier about how some Christians say, well, you should never feel sad, never feel sorrowful. And I'm sure we've either all experienced or heard horror stories of how some Christians just respond to the pain of others. This is a blessing in disguise. You just need to cheer up. Okay. It reminds me of Job's friends. I just want to read some of what Job's friends said. We're going to go to Job chapter 5. Job chapter 5. This is Eliphaz the Temanite. And he had already told Job, he said, Job, just trust God. That's all you need to do. Just trust in God. Turn your attention towards God. Everything will be okay. Job chapter 5. I'm going to pick up in verse 17. Behold, blessed is the one whom God reproves. Therefore, despise not the discipline of the Almighty. I know you're going through some hard times, Job, but really you're blessed. I know you've lost your children, Job, but really God's blessing you. Verse 18, for he wounds, but he binds up. He shatters, but his hands heal. He will deliver you from 6 troubles, and 7, no evil shall touch you. And so he says, I know you're going through hard times now, Job, but, don't worry about it. Because God's going to fix it all. And then down in verse 25, or 25 down to verse 27, so you shall know. And this is, I can't understand how people say stuff like this. Verse 25, you shall know that your offspring shall be many, and your descendants as the grass of the earth. No, you just lost your children, but don't worry, you can have more. What? Verse 26, you shall come to your grave in a ripe old age, like a sheaf gathered up in its season. Behold, this we have searched out. It is true. Hear and know it for your good. And so Eliphaz criticizes Job for lamenting, and he says, Job, stop worrying. God's going to take care of it. He's going to give you more children. Just trust in God. See, Eliphaz, he didn't understand Job's pain. And he didn't take the time to try and understand Job's pain either. And notice with me, what Eliphaz said was true. None of what he said really was false. I mean, in Proverbs chapter 3, we're told in verse 11, my son, do not despise the Lord's discipline, or be weary of his reproof, for the Lord reproves him whom he loves, as a father the son in whom he delights. And so we see the same thing that we saw earlier on when Eliphaz says, blessed is the one whom God reproves. That's what it says in Proverbs 3. Blessed is the one who God reproves. Don't despise the discipline of the Lord. Eliphaz were saying true things, so what was wrong with it? In my opinion, he was saying it at the wrong time. It's my opinion on that. Because the author of Hebrews says the same thing in Hebrews chapter 12. Don't despise the discipline of the Lord. There's a time to say that. But when someone is grieving, we need to let them grieve. And we need to grieve with them. We need to be very careful about criticizing someone for grieving. We need to think hard about that, because there is a time to do it, but we need to be really careful about that. What I've learned is that we usually criticize people because we haven't walked a mile in their shoes. We haven't seen what was in their baggage. If you drive with me, if you ever drive with me, you may notice that I complain about other drivers. I criticize other drivers. The speed limit on down the road is 45, not 25. I don't understand the people who go 25. And those people who turn into the Walgreens on Folsom, but they stop in the street first. No, just continue your turn. You'll be all right. And so you might hear me say things like that if you're riding with me in the car. But a couple of weeks ago, whenever we had that potluck, I was on my way to Rogers Park for the potluck, but I had gumbo with me in the car, in the pot, and I didn't want any of that gumbo to spill in my car. And so I was driving like I was driving Miss Daisy. And I thought for a moment, I was like, man, what if those people who I've been talking about had gumbo in their car? Right? I guess my point is, we don't know what's going on in the car in front of us, do we? We don't know what's going on in the car in front of us. And when we criticize, it's because we don't understand. It's because we don't know what's going on in their lives. It's because we don't understand or see their baggage. We need to work on that. We need to be understanding of one another's pain. One more thing, and then we'll be done. I'm probably over my time, but, I've had a lot of stuff in this sermon. We must be understanding of one another's mistakes. And again, this doesn't mean we condone sin or ignore sin. But we've got to be understanding, because we're all men. We're told the high priest is appointed from among men so that he can deal gently with the ignorant and wayward. We must deal gently with one another. There are going to be times where we mess up. There are going to be times where we wrong one another, where we say the wrong thing on Facebook or whatever, medium you use to communicate with people. There are going to be times where we do that. Are we going to deal gently with those during those times? It's a shame that some Christians, some members of the brotherhood are forever branded with the mistakes that they have made. And so the former alcoholic is always looked down upon as an alcoholic. And the former adulterer is always looked down upon as an adulterer. And the person who wronged me is forever branded with that, because I'm never going to let them live it down. That is not how we deal gently with one another. You know, it's interesting to me that the New Testament, at least not to my knowledge, let me put it this way, the New Testament never describes David as the adulterer or the murderer. David is the man after God's own heart. Going back to Larry's lesson, the New Testament doesn't describe Abraham as the man who lied. Abraham is the father of God's people. And same thing with Samson. In Hebrews chapter 11, Samson isn't identified by his mistakes. He's identified by his faith. And so God is able to deal gently with those who make mistakes. And so we need to be as well. And that means we've got to be a forgiving people. Again, it's easy to criticize whenever we don't walk in someone else's shoes. But maybe if we take some time to understand why someone did what they did, we'd be more forgiving. I guess an example of it's easy to criticize when we're not in someone else's shoes is the way we read Scripture. Because what I found is it's easy to read Scripture and be like, man, what were they doing? You know, like we pick apart the prodigal son. That's why the parable is titled The Prodigal Son. That wasn't Jesus' title for that. That's our title. This is the son who did bad things, the son who went prodigal. But that's not the focus of that parable. The focus of the parable isn't on all of the ways that this son made mistakes. The focus of this parable is on the loving father who's ready to deal gently with those who return to him. You know, I wonder, we criticize the prodigal son, but what would he do if he read our stories? The idea is we all have baggage. We all do. And so we need to work to understand one another's. And so we must be understanding of one another's pain. We must be understanding of one another's mistakes. And that's the lesson. That's the lesson. Because our God is understanding. He understands our pain. He understands our mistakes. So if you're hurting, if you are hurting this evening, you can approach God's throne with a bold frankness. You can approach God's throne and let him know how you feel. That's okay. You can approach God's throne without the mask, wearing sackcloth and sitting in ashes. That's fine. Or maybe there's someone here today who realizes that they've made a lot of mistakes and they've been too afraid to ask God for forgiveness. But you realize God is ready to deal gently with you. And so you want to return to the Lord. Walk to his throne with a bold frankness and tell him you're ready to come back home, because he will accept you. There's someone here this morning who needs to respond to the invitation. Maybe you've, again, left the Lord and you want to come back. Or maybe you want to become a child of God, being baptized into his death, raised to walk in newness of life. There's someone who needs to respond to the invitation. You can do so right now as we stand and as we sing.